Joining us now, senior fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation, Mark Hanna. Good morning, Mark. Thanks for being here. Let's just get your start with your take. With your take from yesterday's meeting, what we know of it between Putin and Xi, and what do you think will be on the agenda these next 2 days?
Yeah, President Xi didn't travel to Moscow to do anything other than to talk about his peace plan and how to end the war. Secretary Blinken, we have to be careful when we watch both the news coming out of Moscow and America's response to that. The fog of diplomacy can sometimes be as blurry as the fog of war, and understanding what's real, what people's motives are, is important. So, this dear friends rhetoric could be overblown. Quickly after President Xi mentioned that, he said, we're strategic partners. It was dismissed, I think, by John Kirby as a marriage of convenience. It's true that China wants to back Russia in kind of bucking the West and sort of revising the narrative of how this war began, but it also wants the war to end. And while it's true that as Secretary Blinken said, a ceasefire would sort of freeze and sap Ukrainian momentum on the battlefield, there are also things in China's plan that Russia would not necessarily like the condemning of the killing of civilians, the threat of nuclear use. So China's not necessarily in lockstep with Russia here, and there are ways in which the United States might actually support the only country in the world that has economic leverage over Russia and a relationship with Russia to help bring an end to this war sooner rather than later. It's getting bloodier. The trench warfare is sort of as brutal as the sort of region of Bakhmut is sort of strategically insignificant, and it's unclear that the West can sustain its support for the war going into 2024, or whether Russia's political objectives are actually achievable in the near term. I sat down with General Mark Milley, and he pretty much said as much, that as a military analysis, a total defeat of Russia is not cannot be expected in the next year.
Yeah, certainly U.S. officials have suggested that Ukraine's efforts to retake Crimea likely would not be successful. You mentioned John Kirby. He dismissed Russia as the, quote, junior partner in that relationship with China. He also said, at least so far, no evidence that Beijing is going to send lethal aid to Russia, but said that has not been ruled out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's important. I mean, it is true that they're a junior partner. China has Russia represents about 3% of Chinese trade, whereas China represents about 30% of Russia's trade. So there is economic leverage here. And China, the United States and Washington, we're going to hear a lot about sort of China giving diplomatic cover to Putin. But let's wonder, we got to, again, with the fog of diplomacy, understand what are the motives here. China has a sincere interest in wanting this war to end. It doesn't benefit from the nuclear use. It doesn't benefit from World War III. And it wants economic stability more than anything. So when you hear the quotes given by President Xi and President Putin, you can hear, for example, President Xi is kind of giving Putin some cover by saying, like, look, your people are going to continue to support you. That's what Putin needs more than anything, because morale at home, domestic support for Putin is waning as the war gets bloodier and as more Russians die. At the same time, Putin is giving President Xi cover because he's giving this kind of revisionist narrative about how the war started and about how the sort of Western-led international order is impinging the sovereignty of countries like Russia and like China. In some ways, the best thing the United States can do is again get China to cheer on a Chinese effort to end the war. It's again unclear that a sort of ceasefire is in Ukraine's interests right now. It's ultimately up to Ukraine. It's ultimately up to Russia to determine what those terms are that are going to lead to the negotiating table, but everybody should want this to end in diplomacy. The alternative is catastrophic.
Yeah, officials, though, both in Washington and Kyiv, suggest it's not yet time for that diplomacy, for those negotiations. A senior fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation, Mark Hanna, we appreciate your perspective on this. We will talk to you again down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, my dear friend.
Take care.